Hello all, I hope you guys had a good weekend. Today we're going to be covering chapters 24 and 25. We're going to start with chapter 24, and I also want to ask you guys to pull out your packets and look at your themes page while we're going through this. Remember when I said a long time ago that hypocrisy versus integrity was going to be a theme in this book? And then you all emailed me asking where that was going to show up in the book. Well, we have finally arrived. Hypocrisy is a thread that we see come up all throughout Maycomb, but especially in chapter 24. In this chapter, Aunt Alexandra is hosting what is called a missionary circle. Basically, what that means is that a bunch of women from her church have come over to discuss a specific missionary and make plans to support them, etc. Honestly, it's not uncommon for churches to still do things like this to bring awareness and raise funds for missionaries. Also, it's not uncommon for there to be various blind spots when we are discussing other cultures and people because of our own blind spots and our innate desire or thought that we are the best. And sometimes these things are big issues, and sometimes they're just differences of opinion on how is the best way to live your life, right? I'm sure some of you have very strong opinions between whether or not cereal or milk should go in the bowl first. It's definitely not a salvation issue, but someday you will probably tell someone they're a terrible person because they do it differently than you do. And I know this is a silly example, but I want you to realize that some of these things that these women are talking about, they're really not trying to be terrible people. And some of the things that they say might even be fine in a different context. But their opinions, in a lot of cases, are very uninformed and therefore have the potential to cause some pretty real harm. And that's where we get into hypocrisy. So we're going to get into some quotes. We're going to skim through this chapter by spotlighting different quotes and unpacking how Harper Lee is trying to get her readers to examine their own hypocrisy and prejudice by hitting us in the face with Maycomb County's missionary circle. All right. Before we get into that, though, I just want to make sure that we all understand what hypocrisy is. We've gone over this before, but I don't know. Maybe you didn't watch that video. I don't know. Hypocrisy is that idea of saying one thing, but then your life doesn't reflect that idea or belief, or judging others for something that you're not willing to look at yourself and get a clear idea of your own stance on. Okay? First quote. Mrs. Merriweather's large brown eyes always filled with tears when she considered the oppressed. Living in that jungle with nobody but J. Grimes Everett, she said. Not a white person'll go near 'em, but that saintly J. Grimes Everett. All right. First things to note, Mrs. Merriweather feels very strongly for the oppressed. But those people have to be pretty far away from her in order for her to even see them as oppressed. Also, I want us to ask what in her words makes this tribe in Africa so sad. And if we actually look at what she says, it's because nobody is with them. This is just untrue, right? They're a group of people living together, they're a tribe, but she feels sorry for them because no white person is near them to show them how to live properly. This is a bit of a side note, but missionaries throughout the ages have had a very difficult time separating Christian religion and morality from a Western lifestyle, confusing the message of Jesus with wearing clean clothes and living in homes with four walls and a roof and glass windows. And so when Mrs. Merriweather is talking about showing these people how to live rightly, she's not just talking about faith. And this isn't unique to her or Alabama or the 1920s, but it's worth noting here. She mourns that these people aren't living in the right kind of home, or that they don't have the correct idea of community, or that there just aren't white people around because how could they know how to properly live unless someone shows them? Next one. Jean Louise, she said, you are a fortunate girl. You live in a Christian home with Christian folks in a Christian town. Out there in J. Grimes Everett's land, there is nothing but sin and squalor. Mrs. Merriweather identifies Maycomb as a very religious town, and it is, right? But she also is so used to the bad parts of the town, like racism. They're so much part of her everyday experience and honestly too close to home that she doesn't see those things as sin. The sin has to be out there somewhere. It has to be outside of herself and outside of her immediate responsibility in order for her to even identify it and see it. Quote number 3. Thing that church ought to do is help her lead a Christian life for those children from here on out. Some of the men ought to go out there and tell that preacher to encourage her. All right, so this is a lot. There are a lot of vague pronouns in this quote, and we're going to unpack it. So in case you didn't pick up on this, what Mrs. Merriweather is saying here is that the white men of Maycomb should go to the black preacher, Reverend Sykes, and tell him that he should go tell Mrs. Robinson, Tom's wife, that she had better lead a Christian life because it's her duty to her children. And now there's so many problems with this because Harper Lee gave us a very clear look at the black community earlier in the book. They know how to support each other far more than we've seen demonstrated by the gossiping community on the white side of Maycomb. Also, Tom and his family have been portrayed as very religious from the start, so the thought that Mrs. Merriweather or any of these women tell Helen Robinson what to do is absolutely ridiculous. Also, I want you to keep in mind that Helen's husband has just been sentenced to death, and these women have absolutely no clue what that feels like. The stuff that has happened to the Robinson family is so far outside these women's spectrum of empathy that you should be rolling your eyes at this conversation. And yet, these women actually, they do mean well. And that is something that I want to emphasize because Harper Lee is trying to get at that idea that it's fine that you mean well. It's great that you mean well. But if you are blinded by prejudice, then you don't have any clear idea of how to actually help people because you're stuck in your own hypocrisy. All right, these next 3 quotes all go together. Hang in there as I read them. Read along with me. So first one, if we just let them know we forgive them. These are all still Mrs. Merriweather talking. If we just let them know we forgive them, that we've forgotten it, then this whole thing will blow over. The cooks and field hands are just dissatisfied, but they're settling down now. They grumbled all next day after that trial. Sophie, I said, you simply are not being a Christian today. Jesus Christ never went around grumbling and complaining, and you know, it did her good. I tell you, Gertrude, you never ought to let an opportunity go by to witness for the Lord. These quotes are also Mrs. Merriweather talking about how the black community has reacted to Tom's trial, and there is a lot to unpack. So in the first quote, Mrs. Merriweather says that the white people should forgive the black people for being so annoying during this whole time with their complaining. She is grateful that they are finally calming down after that trial, and she is very clear to her servant that by being dissatisfied at the results of the trial, which the results were clearly very unjust, but Sophie is not, in fact, being a good Christian person because she is upset by this. Never mind the fact that Jesus talks repeatedly about caring for people who have less, seeking justice, loving mercy, how everyone is baptized in one spirit, and how there is no more slave or free, and all of that, right? Mrs. Merriweather has this idea that Sophie should be happy regardless of her circumstances. And to an extent that is in the Bible, but you also see so many people in Scripture lamenting for wrongs that have happened or lamenting injustice, right? King David himself, he writes so many psalms about relationships that have gone awry or just really hard and tough situations that he's in. And he's not even dealing with these same issues of racism and discrimination that Tom and his family are dealing with as Black people in Alabama during the Great Depression, right? Mrs. Merriweather probably would even say that King David is just complaining, right? Basically, here is the hypocrisy. Mrs. Merriweather basically starts crying because of the so-called oppression of the Maroona people in Africa, but then she chews out her servant for being upset that Tom Robinson was convicted of a crime that he could not have possibly committed. And he was convicted purely based on the color of his skin, right? And I really hope that at this point you're beginning to see the hypocrisy coming through, right? After this section, we have the ladies talk about how it doesn't matter how nice the white people are to the black people because the black people are just terrible. That's on page 265. And then we have some underhanded chatting about how Atticus is a good but misguided person for standing up for the black community. And that's bottom of page 265 up onto page 266. And that's where we get a very interesting quote from Miss Maudie. She responds to Mrs. Merriweather's underhanded criticism of Atticus by saying, his food doesn't stick going down, does it? And Miss Maudie here, she's calling out Mrs. Merriweather, who has just gone on this long rant about how Atticus is misguided for defending a black person. All the while, Mrs. Merriweather is chowing down on the food from his house prepared by a servant, a black woman that he employs, right? You see, Harper Lee is not bad-mouthing Christians in this chapter. Miss Maudie is a Christian. The thing is, though, is that Miss Maudie has clearly put a little bit more effort into seeing beyond the general prejudices of Maycomb because she recognizes that Atticus has actually done the right thing. Harper Lee, through Miss Maudie, is showing us that faith, real faith, faith with integrity is not and should not be ever connected to racism or trying to keep bad social practices alive for the sake of so-called tradition that could potentially harm people. Unfortunately, this doesn't really stop Mrs. Merriweather. She stops discussing Atticus, but continues on to a very open and interesting discussion of hypocrisy that we are going to read next. Hypocrites, Mrs. Perkins. Born hypocrites. At least we don't have that sin on our shoulders down here. People up there, set him free, but you don't see him sitting at the table with him. At least we don't have the deceit to say to him, yes, you're as good as we are, but stay away from us. Down here, we just say, you live your way, and we live ours. In case you didn't catch it, the up there she's talking about is the north of the United States. So on the one hand, she's actually right. Black people faced discrimination and inequality all over the United States, not just in the South. It was just a lot more open in the South for a lot longer. And while Mrs. Merriweather can see that people in the North are prejudiced, she can't see that her community is no better, perhaps even worse sometimes, at actually treating people of color with truly Christian love. And she obviously believes, based on her other quotes, that white people are superior to black people, not just different as she claims here. Our next quote comes from the very end of the chapter. Actually, I think we only have like 2 more left after this, I think. So Atticus comes home and he tells Aunt Alexandra, Scout, Calpurnia, and Miss Maudie that Tom has been killed. We don't know exactly if Tom was trying to actively escape or if he had just lost all hope and figured he might as well run as not, knowing that he would probably be killed regardless. And I want you to notice that Atticus emphasizes that they used unnecessary violence on Tom. He tells the women that there were 17 bullet holes in him. They didn't have to shoot him that much. It's not just the fact that the guards shot Tom, but Atticus emphasizes the number of shots and specifically says that what they did was unnecessary. And Atticus credits this to the fact that, to the guards, Tom was just another black man, which tells you a lot about how guards viewed black prisoners. But also, remember when we talked about the lynch mob and how Scout stops the mob by calling out Mr. Cunningham by name? Names are so important because they force you to see someone as human. We talked about this in Night, but when someone has a number like Ellie or a label like any of the numerous slurs black people were called, it makes it so much easier to not see them as human. Tom knows this and he's lost all hope. And even though Atticus has tried to encourage him that they might be able to appeal it, Tom has been so crushed by the process that he cannot see a light at the end of the tunnel, and so he tries to run and ends up dead. And in Atticus's words, I guess Tom was tired of white men's chances and preferred to take his own. And that actually brings us to chapter 25. Scout tells us that Mr. Underwood, wrote an editorial after Tom died. Remember that Mr. Underwood is the only newspaper publisher person in town, and he says something really important that we are going to read together. Mr. Underwood didn't talk about miscarriages of justice. He was writing so children could understand. Mr. Underwood simply figured it was a sin to kill cripples, be they standing, sitting, or escaping. He likened Tom's death to the senseless slaughter of songbirds by hunters and children, and Maycomb thought that he was trying to write an editorial poetical enough to be reprinted in the Montgomery Advertiser. If you look at your symbolism page in your packet, you will remember that we selected 3 people who symbolized mockingbirds in this book. Mockingbirds are innocent and they live to create beauty and music, but also the title of our book is To Kill a Mockingbird. And this means that we also need to look out for how our mockingbirds might experience some sort of death, either literal death or something more metaphorical. And here we have Mr. Underwood writing so clearly that children could understand that Tom was unjustly killed. He says that it's unjust because Tom is a cripple, which is true, but you also get the sense that because Mr. Underwood is using this idea of the songbird or mockingbird, he's also taking a stand to say that Tom is innocent, that Tom's death was nothing but the senseless slaughter, and the world is worse off because of it. We covered a lot. Please make sure that you rewatch this video if things didn't make sense, or leave me a question in the Google form or in the comments, and I will make sure to answer you. This book is super interesting because you might be tempted to think that Tom Robinson's trial is the climax of the book, and it is not. The action really just picks up from there, and it is beautiful and really, really sad. And on that cheery note, I hope you have a great day. Hang in there, everyone.